millionaire cruelly sabotages a farmer to buy his land. The next morning, he was horrified to see who came to his company. The Bennett family was the epitome of the American dream. Their name was etched into the skyline of New York City, their towering buildings serving as monuments to their success. At the heart of their empire was Richard Bennett, a man whose vision and ambition had turned a modest construction company into one of the largest in the United States. His name commanded respect, his wealth inspired envy, and his legacy was something he guarded fiercely. But for all their power and prestige, the Bennetts were far from perfect. Beneath the veneer of their pristine public image lay a family grappling with the weight of expectations and unspoken tensions. Ethan, the eldest son, was Richard's pride and joy. 32 years old, he had inherited his father's sharp mind and relentless drive. Ethan was the embodiment of discipline, a man who worked tirelessly to prove himself worthy of the empire he was destined to inherit. From the time he was old enough to understand the meaning of legacy, Ethan had dedicated himself to the family business. Richard saw in him a mirror of his younger self, and the two shared a bond forged through ambition and respect. Lucas, Ethan's twin brother, was a stark contrast. Though they shared the same piercing green eyes and chiseled features, their similarities ended there. Where Ethan was grounded and focused, Lucas was carefree and impulsive. His days were spent indulging in the privileges that came with being a Bennett: fast cars, lavish parties, and a string of fleeting romances. Lucas was the wild card, the son who seemed content to let others bear the weight of responsibility while he enjoyed the fruits of their labor. Claire, the youngest and the only daughter, was the family's peacemaker. At 28, she had grown up watching her brothers clash and her father dominate, learning how to navigate the complex dynamics of their world. Claire had married Andrew Whitmore, a charming and ambitious man whose hunger for success rivaled even Richard's. Though deeply in love with Andrew, Claire often found herself torn between loyalty to her husband and her family. Their lives were a carefully constructed puzzle, each piece fitting together to form the perfect picture. But perfection, as they would soon learn, was an illusion. It was a crisp autumn morning when the first domino fell. The sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Bennett estate, casting a golden glow over the expansive living room. Richard sat at the head of the table in his home office, his steely gaze fixed on Ethan. "I want you to handle the Denver project personally," Richard said, his voice steady and authoritative. The Denver deal was no ordinary venture. It was a multi-million-dollar partnership that could solidify Bennett Construction's dominance in the western United States. Ethan nodded without hesitation. "Of course, Dad. I'll make sure everything runs smoothly." His confidence was unwavering, a trait Richard both admired and relied upon. As the conversation unfolded, Lucas strolled into the room, a coffee cup in hand and a smirk on his face. "Ah, the golden boy strikes again," he teased, leaning casually against the doorframe. "What is it this time? Another skyscraper? A whole city, maybe?" Ethan shot him a withering look but said nothing. Richard, however, was less patient. "Lucas, if you spent half as much time working as you do making jokes, you might actually contribute to this family." Lucas shrugged, unbothered. "Why bother? You've already got Ethan to be your perfect little successor." The tension in the room was palpable, but Ethan chose to rise above it. He had long since stopped letting Lucas's jabs get under his skin. He had a job to do, and nothing would distract him from it. The flight to Denver was uneventful, and Ethan spent the next few days immersed in meetings with local officials and potential partners. His meticulous attention to detail and strategic vision were on full display, earning the admiration of everyone in the room. But even the most driven individuals have their limits, and by the end of the week, fatigue began to creep in. It was late evening when Ethan finally wrapped up his work for the day. As he drove back to his hotel along a winding road that hugged the edge of a river, he allowed his mind to wander. He thought of his family, the weight of expectations, and the rare moments he permitted himself to question whether the life he was building was truly his, or simply an extension of his father's dream. The screech of tires and the blinding glare of oncoming headlights jolted him back to reality. A vehicle had swerved into his lane, forcing Ethan to react instinctively. He yanked the steering wheel, and his car skidded on the wet asphalt. The world blurred around him as the vehicle broke through the guardrail and plunged into the icy waters below. Back at the Bennett estate, the phone call came in the dead of night. Richard answered, his usually unshakable demeanor faltering as the voice on the other end delivered the devastating news. Claire's anguished cries echoed through the house as she clutched Andrew's arm for support. Lucas stood frozen, his face pale as the weight of what had happened sank in. The rescue team searched the river for days, but their efforts yielded no trace of Ethan's body. The current was strong, the waters unforgiving. Eventually, they concluded what the family dreaded most. Ethan was gone. Richard, a man who had built an empire through sheer determination, seemed to crumble under the weight of his grief. He withdrew from the business, his once razor-sharp focus dulled by loss. Lucas, uncharacteristically quiet, avoided his family, retreating into a world of self-indulgence. And Andrew, ever the opportunist, began to fill the void Ethan had left, subtly positioning himself as Richard's right-hand man, far away, in the quiet village of Greenwood. The river carried an unconscious man to its banks. Walter Hayes, an elderly farmer making his rounds at dawn, stumbled upon the body. Without hesitation, he hauled the man to safety, unaware of the chain of events he was about to set into motion. But for now, the Bennett family mourned. Their world irreparably changed. The loss of Ethan was not just the loss of a son, a brother, or an heir. It was the loss of their anchor, and the cracks in their foundation were beginning to show. The sun rose over the quiet village of Greenwood, its golden rays stretching across fields of wildflowers and rows of neatly planted vegetables. A rooster crowed in the distance, signaling the start of another day. Walter Hayes, a man in his late 60s with a wiry frame and calloused hands, began his morning routine, clad in overalls and a straw hat. He moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime working the land as he approached the riverbank to check on his irrigation lines. Something unusual caught his eye. Amid the reeds and debris along the water's edge lay the still figure of a man. Walter's heart skipped a beat. He hurried closer, his boots squelching in the mud. The man's clothes were soaked, his face pale, and his chest barely rising with shallow breaths. "Hang in there, son," Walter muttered, kneeling beside him with a strength that belied his age. He hoisted the man over his shoulder and carried him back to the small farmhouse he called home. The first thing Ethan, now a stranger even to himself, remembered was the smell of coffee and the warmth of a quilt draped over him. He blinked against the sunlight streaming through a window, his head pounding and his body aching. A gruff but kind voice broke through the haze. "Welcome back to the land of the living," Walter said, setting a mug of steaming coffee on the bedside table. "You've been out for a couple of days." Ethan tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in his ribs stopped him. "Where am I?" he croaked, his voice hoarse. "You're in Greenwood," Walter replied. "Found you down by the river, lucky you're alive. Looks like the current gave you a beating, though." Greenwood, the name meant nothing to him. Panic flickered in his eyes as he realized he couldn't remember how he had ended up there, or who he even was. I don't remember anything," he said, his voice trembling. Walter's expression softened. "Well, you're safe now. That's what matters. Name's Walter Hayes, by the way. And you?" The question hung in the air, heavy with uncertainty. Ethan opened his mouth, but no answer came. His mind was a blank slate. Walter noticed the fear in his eyes and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's all right, son. We'll figure it out. For now, just focus on getting better." In the days that followed, Ethan, whom Walter began calling Mike for convenience, recovered under Walter's care. He was struck by the simplicity of life in Greenwood. The farmhouse was small but cozy, with mismatched furniture and the smell of fresh bread always lingering in the air. Walter's land stretched across a modest plot, filled with rows of tomatoes, peppers, and squash. It wasn't much by city standards, but it was enough. Mike found solace in the rhythm of farm life. Each day brought tasks that were physically demanding but oddly fulfilling. Under Walter's guidance, he learned to till the soil, plant seeds, and tend to the crops. The work was honest, and the results tangible. For someone whose past life had been defined by boardrooms and business deals, though he couldn't remember that yet, this was a stark but welcome change. "You've got a knack for this, Mike," Walter said one evening as they sat on the porch, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Most folks your age wouldn't last a day out here." Mike managed a small smile. "It feels right. I can't explain it. but it feels like I belong here." Walter took a sip of his sweet tea and nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes life gives you a second chance, even if it doesn't tell you what the first one was." Months turned into years, and Mike became a fixture in Greenwood. He helped Walter modernize the farm, introducing techniques that boosted crop yields and made the operation more sustainable. His ideas were innovative. Though he had no memory of where the knowledge came from, the farm thrived, and word spread about Walter's secret weapon. The townsfolk took to Mike quickly. He was kind, hardworking, and dependable, traits that earned him the respect of even the most skeptical neighbors. Yet, there was always a shadow of sadness in his eyes, a hint of a life lost and a yearning to uncover who he truly was. Every now and then, fragments of memory surfaced, flashes of a city skyline, the hum of an office, the sound of laughter echoing through a grand house. But they were fleeting, like wisps of smoke slipping through his fingers. He never spoke of them to Walter, choosing instead to bury his doubts beneath the satisfaction of a hard day's work. Meanwhile, back in New York, the Bennett family had adjusted, or rather, adapted, to life without Ethan. Richard, though visibly aged by grief, had thrown himself back into the business, relying heavily on Andrew to manage the day-to-day operations. Andrew had skillfully positioned himself as Richard's trusted lieutenant, using the patriarch's vulnerability to consolidate power. Lucas had spiraled further into self-indulgence, his guilt over Ethan's loss manifesting in reckless behavior. Claire, ever the peacemaker, tried to bridge the growing chasm between her father and brother. But her efforts were often overshadowed by Andrew's influence. Though none of them would admit it, the absence of Ethan had left a void that no amount of wealth or success could fill. One crisp autumn morning, a sleek black SUV pulled up to Walter's farm. Mike watched from the porch as two men in suits stepped out, their expressions stern. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered, held a clipboard. "Good morning," the man said, his tone overly formal. "We're here on behalf of Bennett Construction. We're interested in purchasing this property for a development project." Walter's jaw tightened. "This land isn't for sale." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'd encourage you to reconsider. We're prepared to make a very generous offer." Mike's eyes narrowed as he sensed the veiled threat in the man's words. Something about the name Bennett Construction stirred an unease deep within him. Though he couldn't place why, for now he stood silently beside Walter. His fists clenched as the men drove away. Walter sighed heavily. "They won't give up easily," he said. "Developers like them never do." Mike stared after the SUV, a strange sense of determination rising within him. He didn't know who he was or where he came from, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let them destroy the place that had given him a second chance. 5 years after Ethan's disappearance, the Bennett family was still grappling with the hole he had left behind, but the cracks in their foundation were more visible than ever. Richard, once a powerhouse of control and authority, had become a shadow of himself. His days were spent in his towering office overlooking Manhattan, but his fire was dimmed. He trusted fewer people now, leaning heavily on Andrew Whitmore to keep the company afloat. Andrew had positioned himself skillfully from the moment of Ethan's presumed death. He had taken every opportunity to step into roles Ethan once occupied. His calm demeanor, sharp suits, and seemingly tireless work ethic made him appear indispensable. In truth, Andrew had carefully cultivated his image, concealing his true intentions from Richard, Claire, and anyone else who might have dared to look closer. As Andrew sat in a sleek leather chair in his office, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and smirked before answering. "Is it done?" he asked, leaning back and swirling a glass of bourbon in his free hand. A voice on the other end responded affirmatively. Andrew's grin widened. "Good. Let me know if there are any hiccups. Walter Hayes won't stand a chance against us." Hanging up, he placed the glass down and pulled a file from his desk. It was a detailed plan for the acquisition of Greenwood, a project Andrew had been working on for months. The small farming community had become the center of his latest scheme, and Walter's land was key to the deal. With development plans already in motion, Andrew had no intention of letting a stubborn old farmer stand in his way. In the Bennett estate, Claire noticed her husband's late nights and whispered phone calls, but she chalked it up to the pressures of running the company. She had grown accustomed to Andrew's ambition, a trait that had initially drawn her to him. What she didn't know was how far he was willing to go to secure his place in the empire. "Long day?" she asked one evening, as Andrew walked into their bedroom, loosening his tie. He nodded, giving her a quick kiss on the cheek. "You could say that? Your father's still adjusting to the changes we've made?" "It's a lot of work," Claire frowned. "Sometimes I think he's still grieving Ethan, even after all this time." Andrew paused, his expression unreadable. "Of course he is, but the company needs to keep moving forward. It's what Ethan would have wanted, don't you think?" The mention of Ethan's name always brought a heaviness to the room. Claire nodded slowly, not wanting to press further. She trusted Andrew. At least she wanted to. Meanwhile, Lucas was spiraling further into his hedonistic lifestyle. Nightclubs, expensive cars, and meaningless flings filled the void left by his twin brother's absence. He couldn't face the grief or the guilt that gnawed at him, so he drowned it in excess. To most, Lucas seemed like the black sheep of the family, a man wasting his potential, but beneath his careless facade lay a tortured soul. One evening, as Lucas sat alone in a dimly lit bar, his phone buzzed with a message from Claire. "Dad's worried about you. Call me when you can." He stared at the screen for a moment before slipping the phone back into his pocket. The truth was, he couldn't bear to face Richard or Claire, not when his memories of Ethan still haunted him. There were things Lucas knew, things he had buried deep, that he couldn't bring himself to confront. Back at the Bennett headquarters, Andrew called for a private meeting with Richard. The older man entered the conference room, his once confident stride replaced by a measured, almost weary pace. Andrew had grown adept at handling Richard, presenting ideas in ways that made him seem like a dutiful son-in-law rather than a schemer. "I've been looking into the Greenwood acquisition," Andrew began, clicking through a presentation on a large screen. "The land there is prime for development, and it would position us perfectly to expand our reach in the Midwest." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Greenwood? I thought we'd abandoned that project years ago. The locals weren't exactly cooperative." Andrew leaned forward, his expression earnest. "That was then. Times have changed, and I believe with the right approach, we can make it work. Hayes's land is the key to everything. Once we secure it, the rest will fall into place." Richard studied the proposal, his fingers drumming on the table. "What about the people there? Are we offering fair compensation?" Andrew's smile didn't falter, though his patience thinned. "Of course we're making competitive offers, but I should warn you, Walter Hayes has been resistant. If he doesn't cooperate, we may need to take stronger measures." Richard frowned, a flicker of disapproval crossing his face. "I don't want us strong-arming anyone." "Andrew, we're better than that." "Of course," Andrew said smoothly, though his thoughts were already on the next steps. Richard's idealism was a nuisance, but Andrew knew how to maneuver around it. Back in Greenwood, Walter was growing increasingly frustrated. Letters from Bennett Construction had been piling up, each one more aggressive than the last. Their representatives had visited twice in the past week, pressuring him to sell. Walter's patience was wearing thin, but he refused to back down. "They're not taking no for an answer," he muttered to Mike one evening as they worked in the barn. Mike wiped his hands on a rag, his jaw tightening. "Then we'll make them listen." Walter glanced at him, surprised by the edge in his voice. Over the years, Mike had become like a son to him, but there was a fire in his eyes now that Walter hadn't seen before. It was as if the mention of Bennett Construction had awakened something buried deep within him. "You all right, son?" Walter asked. Mike hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I hate seeing people like that try to steamroll the little guy. It's not right." Walter placed a hand on his shoulder. "Well, they'll find out soon enough that this old farm isn't going anywhere." As Mike returned to his room that night, fragments of memories flickered in his mind. Boardrooms, contracts, a man's stern voice giving orders. He shook his head, trying to push them aside, but they lingered, like whispers from a life he couldn't quite grasp. At the Bennett offices, Andrew finalized his next move. He had already arranged for subtle sabotage on Walter's farm, faulty equipment, contaminated water lines, anything that might force the old man's hand. Greenwood was just another obstacle to conquer, and Andrew was willing to do whatever it took. Unbeknownst to Andrew, however, the decisions he was making were setting into motion events that would unravel everything he had built. The past has a way of catching up, and in Greenwood, the storm was brewing. The crisp morning air carried the scent of dew-covered grass and freshly tilled soil as Mike walked through the rows of Walter's farm, checking the irrigation system. Greenwood was waking up, its small cluster of homes and farms coming alive with the sounds of roosters crowing and tractors starting. Life here was simple, predictable even, but that predictability had been disrupted in recent weeks. Bennett Construction's relentless pressure to acquire Walter's land was starting to take its toll. Mike adjusted a nozzle on the irrigation line, watching as water flowed steadily into the soil. He frowned, his mind replaying the visit from the company's representatives. Something about their tone, their arrogance, had struck a nerve. He didn't know why, but the name Bennett Construction stirred a strange mix of emotions in him. It felt personal, even though he had no memory of ever dealing with them. Walter approached, his expression grim. He held a letter in his hand, the company's logo stamped in bold at the top. "Another one," he said, handing it to Mike. "They're upping their offer again, but it's the same story. They want me out, and they're not taking no for an answer." Mike scanned the letter, his jaw tightening. The words were polite, but the message was clear. "Sell, or we'll make your life difficult." "They don't scare easily, do they?" Mike muttered, crumpling the paper. Walter sighed, leaning on his cane. "No, they don't. But this land's been in my family for generations. I'm not about to let some big-shot developers take it away." Mike nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then we fight." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity on the farm. Mike worked tirelessly, repairing equipment, fortifying fences, and ensuring the crops were thriving. Walter, though physically limited by age, guided him with decades of wisdom. Their bond had grown strong over the years, a relationship built on mutual respect and shared values. But the pressure from Bennett Construction was escalating. One morning, Mike discovered that a section of their irrigation system had been sabotaged. Pipes were broken, and the water supply had been contaminated with an oily residue. It was no accident. "Sabotage," Walter said grimly as he inspected the damage. "They're trying to force me out." Mike's fists clenched at his sides. "This is crossing a line." Walter placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll fix it, son. We've dealt with worse." But Mike wasn't ready to let it go. That evening, he drove into the heart of Greenwood, where the townsfolk gathered at a small diner that served as the community's unofficial meeting place. He addressed them, his voice firm and passionate. "We can't let them bully us," he said, standing in front of the room. "This farm isn't just Walter's livelihood. It's part of this community if they take his land. What's next? We need to stand together," the crowd murmured in agreement. Greenwood was a tight-knit community, and Walter was well respected, but fear lingered in the air. Bennett Construction was a giant, and most of the villagers felt powerless against such a formidable opponent, while Mike rallied support in Greenwood. Andrew was growing impatient in New York. His initial attempts to acquire Walter's land had been met with resistance, and the sabotage hadn't yielded the results he'd hoped for. He sat in his sleek office, tapping his pen against the desk as he reviewed reports from his team. "It's taking too long," he muttered, his frustration evident. "I need that land, and I don't care how we get it." One of his subordinates hesitated before speaking. "Sir, the locals are starting to push back. There's talk of a community effort to resist the acquisition." Andrew's eyes narrowed. "Then make them an offer they can't refuse, or remind them what happens when they do." His words were cold, calculated. Andrew was no stranger to playing dirty, and he was willing to escalate his tactics to secure the deal. Back in Greenwood, Mike and Walter worked late into the night, repairing the damaged irrigation system. The moonlight cast a soft glow over the fields as they toiled, their determination unwavering. "You don't have to do this, you know," Walter said, his voice quiet. "This isn't your fight." Mike paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "It is my fight," he replied. "This farm gave me a second chance. I'm not going to stand by and let someone destroy it." Walter smiled faintly, his weathered face etched with gratitude. "You're a good man, Mike. Don't let them take that away from you." As they finished the repairs, Mike felt a strange sense of clarity. He didn't know where he had come from or who he had been, but here, working alongside Walter, he had found a purpose, and he wasn't about to let anyone take it from him. The next morning, the battle escalated. A team of surveyors arrived on Walter's property, claiming they had the right to assess the land for future development. Mike confronted them, his tone calm but firm. "You don't belong here," he said, standing his ground. "This is private property." The lead surveyor smirked. "We're just doing our job. If you've got a problem, take it up with Bennett Construction." Mike's eyes narrowed. "You can tell Bennett Construction that this land isn't for sale." The standoff ended with the surveyors leaving, but the tension lingered. Mike knew this was just the beginning. Bennett Construction wasn't going to back down, and he would need to prepare for whatever came next. As the days turned into weeks, Mike found himself grappling with an unfamiliar anger. The name Bennett Construction haunted him, stirring emotions he couldn't explain. He had dreams, fragments of memories that didn't fit with his life in Greenwood. A city skyline, a conference room, the sound of a man's voice echoing in his mind. "Ethan," the voice said. Mike woke up in a cold sweat, the name reverberating in his head. He didn't know what it meant, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was important. Meanwhile, Andrew was preparing his next move. He had underestimated Walter Hayes and the resilience of Greenwood, but he wouldn't make the same mistake twice. He called a meeting with his team, outlining a new strategy to pressure the community into submission. "This isn't just about the land," he said, his tone steely. "It's about sending a message. No one stands in our way." Unbeknownst to Andrew, his actions were setting into motion a chain of events that would soon unravel everything he had worked to build. In Greenwood, Mike was readying himself for a fight he didn't fully understand. Yet, and in New York, the name Bennett Construction was about to come crashing back into his life. The sun was setting over Greenwood, casting long shadows across the fields as Mike sat on the front porch of Walter's farmhouse. His hands were calloused from a day of work, but his mind wasn't on the crops. He turned the letter from Bennett Construction over in his hands, its bold logo glaring up at him. The name stirred something deep and unsettling, a feeling he couldn't quite pin down. "What's on your mind, Mike?" Walter asked, stepping outside with 2 mugs of coffee. Mike hesitated, staring at the horizon. "I think it's time I go see them." Walter raised an eyebrow. "See who?" "The people behind this Bennett Construction," Mike said, his voice steady but firm. "They keep pushing, sabotaging, and bullying their way into Greenwood. I need to look them in the eye and tell them they're not taking this land." Walter studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. "You sure about this? Once you go down that road, there's no turning back." Mike nodded. "I'm sure." The following morning, Mike packed a small bag, said his goodbyes, and set out for New York City. Walter watched him leave with a mixture of pride and worry. He trusted Mike's judgment, but something about this fight felt bigger than either of them realized as Mike drove toward the city. The landscape shifted from rolling hills and open fields to concrete towers and endless highways. The closer he got to Manhattan, the more uneasy he felt. Flashes of memory flickered in his mind. Images of bustling streets, sleek office buildings, and the faint sound of someone calling his name. Ethan. By the time he reached the towering headquarters of Bennett Construction, his nerves were taut. The building was a sleek monolith of glass and steel, standing as a testament to power and wealth. Mike squared his shoulders and stepped inside, his boots clicking against the marble floor. The receptionist barely glanced up as he approached the desk. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Mike said, his voice calm but firm. "But I need to speak to someone in charge about Greenwood." The mention of Greenwood caught her attention, and she frowned slightly. "One moment." She picked up the phone and murmured something before gesturing toward a seating area. "Someone will be with you shortly." Mike sat down, his eyes scanning the opulent lobby. Something about this place felt strangely familiar, but he couldn't place why. Before he could dwell on it further, 2 men in suits approached him. "Mr. Hayes?" one of them asked. Mike nodded, standing to meet them. "That's me. This way," the man said, leading him toward the elevators. The ride up was silent, the tension palpable. When the elevator doors opened, Mike was ushered into a large conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a breathtaking view of the city. At the head of the table sat a man he immediately disliked. "Andrew Whitmore," the man said, standing to greet him with a polished smile. "I understand you're here about Greenwood." Mike's jaw tightened as he shook Andrew's hand. "I'm here to tell you that you're not getting Walter Hayes' land." Andrew's smile didn't waver, but there was a flicker of something cold in his eyes. I appreciate your passion, Mr. Hayes, but this is business. Greenwood is an ideal location for our development project, and we've made very generous offers to the landowners. Mike stepped closer, his voice low but firm. Generous? You mean the sabotage, the harassment? Is that what you call generous? Andrew's expression darkened. But before he could respond, the door opened, and a voice cut through the tension. What's going on here? Mike turned to see an older man entering the room, tall, with a commanding presence and eyes that seemed to pierce right through him. There was something familiar about him, something that made Mike's heart race. Andrew's demeanor shifted instantly. Richard, he said smoothly, this is Mr. Hayes. He's here about Greenwood. Richard Bennett's gaze shifted to Mike, his brow furrowing slightly. For a moment, he seemed frozen, his expression unreadable. Then he shook his head as if dismissing a thought. We'll handle this later, Richard said curtly to Andrew before turning back to Mike. I'd like a word with you. As they stepped into Richard's office, Mike felt a strange unease settle over him. The room was grand, yet understated, with shelves lined with awards and framed photographs. Richard gestured for him to sit, but Mike remained standing. You're passionate about this land, Richard said, leaning against his desk. Why? Mike met his gaze. Because it's not just land. It's someone's home, someone's legacy. People like you don't seem to understand that. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. People like me. Mike didn't back down. Yeah, people who see everything in dollars and contracts. For a long moment, Richard studied him, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. You remind me of someone I used to know. Before Mike could respond, the office door burst open, and an older janitor stepped in, holding a mop. Sorry, Mr. Bennett, The man stopped abruptly, his eyes widening as they landed on Mike. Ethan, the janitor whispered, his voice trembling. Mike froze, his heart pounding. What did you call me? Ethan, the man repeated, stepping closer. You're Ethan Bennett. I'd recognize you anywhere. The room went silent, the weight of the words hanging in the air. Richard's face paled as he stared at Mike. His mind racing, memories flooded back. Ethan's laugh, his determination, the day they lost him. Ethan, Richard whispered, his voice breaking. Is it really you? Mike staggered back, his head spinning. No, he said, shaking his head. You got the wrong person. My name's Mike. I don't know what you're talking about. But the name Ethan, rang in his ears like a bell he couldn't unhear. Deep down, something inside him stirred, something that couldn't be ignored. The tension in Richard Bennett's office was thick enough to cut with a knife. The name Ethan hung in the air like a specter, refusing to be ignored. Mike, Ethan, stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The older janitor, clearly shaken, kept staring at him as though he'd seen a ghost. I don't know what you're talking about, Mike said, his voice uneven. I'm not Ethan. My name is Mike Hayes. Richard's piercing gaze didn't waver. He stepped closer, his hands trembling slightly. You look exactly like my son. You even sound like him. His voice cracked on the last word. Ethan died 5 years ago. Or at least, that's what we thought. Mike shook his head, backing toward the door. This is a mistake. I'm not your son. I work on a farm in Greenwood. I don't know anything about you or your family. But as the words left his mouth, they felt hollow. Fragments of memories flickered at the edges of his mind. Faces he couldn't place. A name that felt both foreign and familiar. Ethan. The name resonated like a distant echo, refusing to be silenced. Wait! Richard called out as Mike turned to leave. If you're not Ethan, then prove it. Tell me where you're from. Tell me your story. Mike hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. I don't remember anything before 5 years ago, he admitted quietly. Walter Hayes found me by the river in Greenwood. I've lived there ever since. Richard exchanged a look with the janitor, whose name tag read, Tom. Tom nodded knowingly, as if confirming what Richard already feared. That river, Richard murmured. It runs through Colorado. Ethan's car went off the bridge near there. Mike clenched his jaw, willing himself to leave, but his feet refused to move. The pieces of a puzzle he didn't know he was trying to solve were starting to fit together, and it scared him. Back in Andrew's office, the atmosphere was markedly different. He sat at his desk, hands steepled, as he processed what he'd just witnessed. The man who claimed to be Mike Hayes was Ethan Bennett. He was sure of it. And if Ethan was alive, Andrew's carefully constructed plans were in jeopardy. He pressed a button on his phone, summoning his assistant. "Get Lucas on the line," he ordered. Lucas, still groggy from the previous night's escapades, answered with a slurred, "What do you want?" "We have a problem," Andrew said, his voice sharp. "Ethan is alive." There was a long pause on the other end. Then, Lucas laughed bitterly. "That's not funny, Andrew." "I'm not joking," Andrew snapped. "He just walked into the building. Your father's with him right now." Lucas sat up, the humor draining from his voice. "Ethan's alive," he repeated, disbelief and fear mingling in his tone. How is that possible?" Andrew's voice lowered. "I don't know, but if he remembers who he is, everything we've worked for, everything I've worked for, could fall apart." Lucas was silent for a moment. "What do you expect me to do?" "Come to the office," Andrew said. "We need to figure out how to handle this." Meanwhile, Richard led Mike to a quieter room, away from prying eyes. He gestured toward a chair, but Mike remained standing, his arms crossed defensively. "Let me show you something," Richard said, retrieving a photo album from a nearby shelf. He opened it to a page featuring a young Ethan, smiling broadly at the camera. Beside him stood Lucas, their matching features unmistakable. Mike stared at the photo, his chest tightening. The man in the picture was identical to him, or rather, he was identical to the man in the picture. A wave of dizziness washed over him as he struggled to reconcile what he was seeing. "I don't remember any of this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know these people." "But you are him," Richard insisted, his voice thick with emotion. "You're my son, I know it in my heart." Mike shook his head, taking a step back. "No, I'm not your son. I'm not Ethan. I'm just Mike Hayes." Richard's shoulders sagged, and for the first time in years, he looked truly vulnerable. "If there's even a chance," he began, his voice breaking. "Please, let me run a DNA test just to be sure." Mike hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He didn't want to open this door. It felt like stepping into a life he wasn't ready to face. But the truth, whatever it was, wouldn't leave him alone. "Fine," he said at last. "Do the test, but don't expect me to be someone I'm not." As the DNA test process began, news of Ethan's potential return started to ripple through the company. Whispers circulated among the staff, some excited, others skeptical. To many, Ethan Bennett was a legend, a name spoken with reverence and sorrow. The idea of his return felt almost too good to be true, but not everyone was pleased. Andrew paced his office like a caged animal, his mind racing. The DNA test would confirm what he already knew, and once Richard welcomed Ethan back into the fold, Andrew's position of power would be at risk. "You've been gone for 5 years," Andrew muttered under his breath, "and now you think you can just come back and take what's mine." He slammed his fist on the desk, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent room. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Later that evening, Lucas arrived at the office, his face pale and drawn. Andrew wasted no time bringing him up to speed. "What do we do?" Lucas asked, his voice trembling. Andrew narrowed his eyes. "You knew, didn't you?" Lucas froze, his silence confirming Andrew's suspicion. Andrew's lip curled in disgust. "You knew he was alive, and you didn't say anything. Why?" Lucas looked away, shame written all over his face. "I didn't know for sure," he mumbled. I thought maybe it was better this way. Better for you, maybe." Andrew sneered. "You've been riding the wave of his absence while your father grieved himself half to death. And now he's back, ready to expose everything." Lucas clenched his fists, anger and guilt warring within him. "What do you want me to do, Andrew? Just tell me." Andrew's eyes gleamed with cold calculation. "For now, nothing. But when the time comes, you'll do whatever it takes to make sure Ethan doesn't ruin everything." In Greenwood, Walter sat alone on the porch, staring at the horizon. He had watched Mike drive away that morning with a heavy heart, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Though he didn't fully understand the connection between Mike and Bennett Construction, he knew one thing for certain. The world Mike was stepping into was far more dangerous than the simple life they'd built on the farm. "Come back in one piece, son," Walter murmured into the night, the worry etched into his voice carrying on the wind. The DNA results arrived 2 days later, and the air in Richard Bennett's office was electric with tension. Mike sat stiffly in a chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap across the desk. Richard held the envelope as if it contained the answer to all his prayers. His fingers trembled as he broke the seal and pulled out the single sheet of paper. For a moment, he said nothing, his eyes scanning the text. Then he exhaled sharply, his voice trembling as he spoke. "It's a match. You're Ethan. You're my son." Mike felt the words hit him like a punch to the gut. He stared at Richard, his mind spinning. The proof was there in black and white, but it still didn't feel real. "I don't remember being your son," he said quietly. "I don't remember this life, this family. I don't remember you." Richard's expression was a mixture of relief and sorrow. "But you are Ethan," he insisted, leaning forward. "You don't have to remember everything right now, but you have to believe me. You belong here." Mike shook his head, standing abruptly. "I don't belong anywhere. Not in Greenwood. Not here. I don't know who I am anymore." He turned and walked out of the office, leaving Richard alone with the paper still clutched in his hand. As Mike made his way through the corridors of Bennett Construction, employees stopped and stared, whispering to one another. The resemblance was uncanny, and the rumors were spreading like wildfire. Mike felt their eyes on him, their curiosity like a weight on his shoulders. He needed air. He needed space. Elsewhere in the building, Lucas sat in Andrew's office, staring at the floor. The news of the DNA test had shaken him. Ethan was back, and there was no denying it now. The guilt that had been simmering inside Lucas for years threatened to boil over. "I need to talk to him," Lucas said finally, breaking the tense silence. Andrew looked up from his desk, his expression hard. "Talk to him? What good will that do?" Lucas's jaw tightened. "He's my brother." Andrew stood, his voice sharp. "He's your competition. Do you really think Richard's going to look at you the same way now that Ethan's back? He was always the favorite, and now he's got the ultimate redemption story. You'll be nothing more than the spare." Lucas flinched at the words, but he didn't respond. Deep down, he knew Andrew was right, but he couldn't ignore the part of him that wanted to make amends. The weight of his secret was crushing, and he needed to face it. Face Ethan. Mike had just stepped outside when Lucas found him. The two brothers stood on the steps of the building, the noise of the city swirling around them. For a moment, neither spoke. "It's really you," Lucas said finally, his voice barely audible. Mike turned to face him, his expression guarded. "So, they tell me." Lucas shoved his hands into his pockets, unsure of what to say. He'd imagined this moment countless times, but now that it was here, the words wouldn't come. "I thought you were dead," Lucas said after a long pause. "We all did." "Apparently not," Mike replied, his tone flat. Lucas hesitated, his guilt bubbling to the surface. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice trembling. I knew you might be alive." Mike's head snapped toward him, his eyes narrowing. "What?" Lucas's throat tightened, but he forced himself to continue. "After the accident, I got a call. Someone said they saw you near the river, that you might have survived, but I didn't. I didn't follow up." Mike stared at him, his mind racing. "You knew I could have been alive and you didn't do anything." Lucas's shoulders sagged. "I was scared. Okay. Scared of what it would mean if you came back. You were always Dad's favorite. You were the one who had it all together, and I was just me. I thought if you were gone, maybe I'd finally have a chance." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of betrayal. Mike's jaw clenched as he struggled to process what Lucas had just admitted. "You left me," he said, his voice low and laced with anger. "You left me to fend for myself because you were jealous." Lucas didn't deny it. "I didn't know for sure if it was you," he said weakly, "and by the time I thought about looking, it was too late." Mike took a step closer, his eyes blazing. "You don't get to excuse this. Lucas, you don't get to make this about you." "I'm sorry," Lucas said, his voice breaking. "I've regretted it every single day." Mike shook his head, stepping back. "Sorry doesn't change what happened." He turned and walked away, leaving Lucas standing alone on the steps. the weight of his confession pressing down on him like a leaden cloak. Back inside, Richard sat at his desk, staring out the window. The return of Ethan had stirred a whirlwind of emotions. Relief, joy, but also guilt. He had always favored Ethan, and he knew it. Lucas's struggles had often been overshadowed by Ethan's success, and Richard couldn't help but wonder if his own actions had driven a wedge between his sons. Tom, the janitor who had recognized Ethan, knocked softly on the door. "Mr. Bennett," he said, stepping inside. "If I may, maybe you should give him some time. Coming back like this. It's a lot for anyone to process." Richard sighed heavily, nodding. "You're right, Tom, but I've already lost him once. I don't want to lose him again." That evening, Mike sat alone in a small motel room, the city lights flickering outside the window. He held the DNA results in his hands, reading the words over and over again. Ethan Bennett. It felt like someone else's name, someone else's life. He thought of Walter, of the quiet life he'd built in Greenwood. That life had felt real, honest. But now, it seemed like a dream compared to the storm he'd walked into. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. He opened it to find Claire standing there, her eyes red from crying. "Can I come in?" she asked softly. Mike hesitated, then stepped aside to let her in. She sat on the edge of the bed, wringing her hands nervously. "I'm sorry," she said, "for everything, for how overwhelming this must be. But Ethan, if you are Ethan, I need you to know how much we've missed you. How much I've missed you." Mike sat across from her, his expression unreadable. "I don't know who I am, Claire," he admitted. "I don't know if I can be the person you're hoping for." Claire reached out, placing a hand on his. "You don't have to figure it all out right now. Just don't disappear again." Mike nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. "I'll try." The morning light filtered through the blinds of the motel room as Mike woke to the sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand. He squinted at the unfamiliar device Claire had handed him the night before, insisting he keep in touch. The name Richard flashed on the screen, hesitating for a moment. He answered. "Ethan." Richard's voice came through, cautious, yet determined. "We need to talk. I know this is overwhelming, but there's something you need to know. Something about Andrew." Mike sat up, running a hand through his hair. "What about him?" "Not over the phone," Richard said firmly. "Come to my office." "Please!" Mike exhaled sharply, still uneasy with being called Ethan. "All right, I'll be there." The Bennett construction headquarters hummed with activity as Mike entered, trying to ignore the stares and whispers that followed him. By now, the rumors of Ethan's return had spread throughout the building, and every glance felt like a weight pressing down on him. When he reached Richard's office, the older man was already waiting, a file spread open on his desk. "Thank you for coming," Richard said, gesturing for him to sit. Mike complied, though his posture remained guarded. Richard slid the file toward him. "Andrew's been manipulating this company for years. At first, I thought it was just ambition, but it's more than that. He's been embezzling money, redirecting funds from projects, and worse, sabotaging deals to gain leverage." Mike frowned, flipping through the pages. The evidence was damning. Falsified documents, altered budgets, and records of payments to shady contractors. "Why haven't you stopped him?" Richard sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Because I didn't realize how deep it went until recently. He's clever, careful, but with you back, I believe we have a chance to expose him. His arrogance will be his undoing." Mike shook his head. "Why involve me? I don't know this company or its politics. I'm not the Ethan you think I am." "But you are," Richard said firmly. "And whether or not you remember, you have a right to be here. This is your family, your legacy. And Andrew, he's a threat to everything we've built." Mike hesitated, his thoughts swirling. Part of him wanted to walk away, to return to Greenwood and the simplicity of the farm, but another part, a deeper, quieter part, felt a flicker of responsibility, even if he couldn't explain why. "What do you need me to do?" he asked finally. Richard's shoulders relaxed slightly, relief evident in his expression. "We need to confront him, but we have to be strategic. If we move too soon, he'll find a way to cover his tracks. I've asked our legal team to prepare a case, but we'll need your help to piece everything together." Mike nodded, though uncertainty lingered in his chest. "All right, let's do it." Meanwhile, Andrew sat in his corner office, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. He leaned back in his chair, scrolling through his phone as a smug smile played on his lips. He had spent the past 5 years carefully positioning himself as the power behind the Bennett empire, and he wasn't about to let Ethan, or anyone else, jeopardize that. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he said sharply. Lucas stepped inside, his expression tense. "We need to talk." Andrew raised an eyebrow, motioning for him to sit. "What's on your mind?" Lucas hesitated, his guilt evident. "I told Ethan the truth about the call, about how I knew he might be alive." Andrew's smile faded, replaced by a cold glare. "You did what?" "I had to," Lucas said, his voice trembling. "It was eating me alive." Andrew stood abruptly, his tone icy. "You just handed him ammunition to use against us. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Lucas looked away, shame coloring his face. "I couldn't keep lying." Andrew exhaled sharply, pacing the room. "Fine. If Ethan wants a fight, we'll give him one, but let me be clear. If you're not with me, you're against me, and if you're against me, you'll regret it." Lucas swallowed hard, but said nothing. The following day, Mike met with Claire in a quiet corner of the company cafeteria. She had always been the peacekeeper of the family, and now, more than ever, she felt the need to bridge the growing divide between her brothers. "Andrew's dangerous," she said, her voice low. "You need to be careful." Mike studied her, searching for any trace of deceit, but found none. "Why are you telling me this?" Claire hesitated, then leaned closer. "Because I've seen what he's capable of. He's not just trying to secure his position. He's trying to take over completely. He's been isolating Dad, cutting Lucas out. And now with you back, I think he's desperate." Mike nodded slowly. "Richard already showed me some of the evidence. We're working on a plan to take him down." Claire's eyes widened. "Be careful. He won't go down without a fight." Later that afternoon, Mike and Richard presented their findings to the legal team. The evidence was overwhelming, but they needed one more piece to solidify their case. A direct link to Andrew's sabotage efforts in Greenwood. Mike sat in the conference room, flipping through the files. "If we can tie him to the sabotage on Walter's farm, it'll prove his pattern of unethical behavior." Richard nodded. "And it'll protect Greenwood from further damage." The meeting adjourned with a plan in place. Gather the missing evidence, confront Andrew, and present their case to the board. That evening, Mike returned to the motel, his mind racing. He thought of Walter, of the peaceful life he'd left behind. He thought of Lucas, whose betrayal still stung. And he thought of Andrew, the man who had manipulated his family and nearly destroyed Greenwood. For the first time, he felt a sense of purpose beyond the farm. He didn't fully remember his old life, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't let Andrew get away with what he'd done. In his office, Andrew stared out the window, his expression dark. He could feel the walls closing in, but he wasn't ready to give up. "Not yet. This isn't over," he muttered, his reflection staring back at him. Not by a long shot. The boardroom at Bennett Construction was buzzing with tension. The long mahogany table, polished to perfection, reflected the steely expressions of the board members seated around it. At the head of the table sat Richard Bennett, his presence commanding as ever despite the years of strain. To his left was Mike, no longer Mike Hayes, but Ethan Bennett, his identity now firmly acknowledged. He looked composed, yet his jaw was tight with determination. Andrew Whitmore strode into the room moments later, his suit impeccably tailored, his confidence as unshakable as ever. He greeted the board with his usual charm, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes as they settled on Ethan. "Glad to see we're all here," Andrew said, taking his seat near Richard. "What's the agenda for today, Richard?" Richard leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "The agenda is you, Andrew." Andrew's smile faltered for a brief second, before returning, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Me? Well, I'm flattered, but I'm not sure what you mean." Ethan placed a stack of documents on the table, sliding them toward the center. His voice was calm, but the edge in it was unmistakable. "These are financial records, project logs, and internal emails, evidence of your embezzlement, your sabotage of company deals, And your attempts to force Walter Hayes off his land in Greenwood. Andrew's face hardened. I don't know what you're talking about. Richard spoke next, his tone heavy with disappointment. Don't insult our intelligence, Andrew. We've been piecing this together for months. You've been lining your pockets at the company's expense and jeopardizing its reputation. That ends today. The board members murmured amongst themselves, their expressions ranging from shock to anger. Andrew's charm had won him many allies. But the evidence now laid bare was impossible to ignore. Andrew's mind raced. He had always prided himself on being 10 steps ahead. But this was unexpected. He glanced around the room, calculating his next move. This is absurd, he said, his voice rising. These so-called records could be fabricated. Ethan's been gone for 5 years. How do we know he didn't manufacture this to undermine me? Ethan met his gaze head-on. Because I've been working with Dad and the legal team. These documents were pulled directly from the company's servers. You can deny it all you want, but the truth is right here. Richard pushed a folder toward one of the board members. You'll find everything you need to verify the authenticity of these claims. We've already double-checked. The board member, an older woman with sharp eyes, opened the folder and scanned its contents. She looked up at Andrew, her expression cold. It's all here, Andrew. The discrepancies in the financial reports, the unauthorized transfers, even correspondence tying you to the sabotage in Greenwood. Andrew's composure finally cracked. This is a witch hunt, he snapped. You're all turning on me because Ethan decided to come back and play the hero. No, Richard said firmly. We're holding you accountable for your actions. You've betrayed this company and this family. Lucas, sitting quietly at the far end of the table, felt a pang of guilt. He had spent years letting Andrew manipulate him, and now it was all unraveling. He cleared his throat, drawing the room's attention. There's something else, Lucas said, his voice shaky but resolute. Andrew approached me weeks ago, after Ethan came back. He tried to convince me to side with him, to help him discredit Ethan. He's been planning this for years. Andrew's eyes narrowed. You're lying. Lucas shook his head, looking directly at his father. I should have spoken up sooner, but I didn't. I'm sorry, Dad. I let him pull me into his schemes, and I didn't do anything to stop him. Richard's face was a mix of anger and pain. He took a deep breath before responding. We'll address your part in this later, Lucas. Right now, we need to focus on Andrew. Andrew's desperation boiled over. You think you can just get rid of me? I've been running this company while you've been grieving and wallowing in self-pity, he spat, looking directly at Richard. If it weren't for me, Bennett Construction wouldn't be where it is today. Ethan stood, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. This company was built on integrity, something you clearly don't understand. You've used it for your own gain, and now you're going to face the consequences. 2 security guards entered the room, summoned earlier by Richard. Andrew's gaze darted between them and the board members, his confidence crumbling. You can't do this, he said, his voice shaking. You need me. No, Richard said, his tone final. We don't. As the guards escorted Andrew out of the room, the board members exchanged uneasy glances. The damage Andrew had done would take time to repair, but there was a sense of relief in the air. The storm he had created was finally over. After the meeting, Richard called Ethan into his office. The 2 men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the day settling over them. You did good today, Richard said at last. Better than I could have hoped. Ethan shook his head. I didn't do it for the company. I did it for Walter, for Greenwood. That's where I belong. Richard frowned. Ethan, I'm not staying, Dad. Ethan interrupted gently. This isn't my life anymore. I've found something better, something simpler. I can't go back to being the person I was. Richard's expression softened. I understand, but promise me you'll stay connected. I've lost you once. I don't want to lose you again. Ethan nodded. I promise. Back in Greenwood, Walter was waiting on the porch when Ethan returned. He stood as the truck pulled into the driveway, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile. You're back, Walter said. His tone warm, Ethan stepped out of the truck, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. Yeah, I'm back. As they sat on the porch, the sun setting over the fields, Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The chaos of New York was behind him, and for the first time, he felt like he truly belonged. The crisp air of Greenwood carried a sense of calm that Ethan hadn't fully appreciated until now. After the whirlwind of revelations and confrontations in New York, being back on Walter's farm felt grounding. The rows of vegetables, the sound of birds in the distance, and Walter's steady presence reminded Ethan of the life he had built over the past 5 years, one far removed from the chaos of his family's corporate empire. As he unloaded supplies from his truck, Walter approached, leaning on his cane. "You look lighter," the old man said, his tone gruff but kind. "Like you've left something heavy behind." Ethan chuckled softly. "You could say that." He paused, glancing at the sprawling fields around them. "I didn't think coming back here would feel this right. After everything in New York, I wasn't sure what to expect." Walter nodded knowingly. "Greenwood has a way of reminding you what really matters." For a moment, the two stood in comfortable silence, the sounds of the farm filling the air. But Ethan's mind drifted back to his family, to Richard, Claire, and even Lucas. He had walked away from them, but a part of him wondered if he could truly leave them behind. In New York, the aftermath of Andrew's downfall rippled through Bennett Construction. The board worked tirelessly to untangle the mess he had left behind, while Richard focused on repairing the damage to the company's reputation. But his mind often wandered to Ethan, his return both a blessing and a reminder of the years they had lost. Claire, ever the mediator, visited Richard one evening in his study. She found him staring at a photo of their family from years ago, his expression distant. "You miss him, don't you?" she asked gently. Sitting across from him, Richard sighed, setting the photo down. "I do, but I understand why he left. He's not the same person he was 5 years ago. None of us are." Claire hesitated before speaking again. "Maybe it's not about him coming back to us. Maybe it's about us finding a way to meet him where he is." Richard looked at her, his eyes softening. "What do you mean?" "Greenwood," Claire said simply. "He found something there that we couldn't give him. Maybe it's time we see it for ourselves." A week later, Ethan was working in the fields when a familiar car pulled up to the farm. He straightened, wiping the sweat from his brow. As Richard stepped out, followed closely by Claire, they both looked out of place in their polished shoes and city attire, but their expressions held a mix of curiosity and resolve. "What are you doing here?" Ethan asked, surprised but not unkind. Claire smiled, shielding her eyes from the sun. "We wanted to see what all the fuss was about." Richard stepped forward, his gaze taking in the sprawling fields and the modest farmhouse. "This is where you've been all these years," he said, his tone thoughtful. Ethan crossed his arms, unsure of what to say. "Yeah, this is home." Richard nodded slowly. "It suits you." Walter appeared from the barn, his sharp eyes taking in the visitors. He approached with a wary but polite nod. "You must be Ethan's family." Richard extended a hand. "Richard Bennett, and you must be Walter Hayes." Walter shook his hand firmly. "That's right. Welcome to Greenwood." The day was spent giving Richard and Claire a tour of the farm. Walter explained the techniques he and Ethan had developed to improve crop yields, while Ethan shared stories of the community and the simple joys of working the land. Claire listened intently, her admiration for her brother growing with each passing moment. By the time the sun began to set, Richard seemed more relaxed than Ethan had ever seen him. They sat on the porch, sipping iced tea as the horizon blazed with hues of orange and red. "This place, it's incredible," Richard admitted, his voice tinged with awe. "I can see why you chose it." Ethan glanced at him, his expression softening. "It's not just the place, Dad. It's the life I've built here. It's honest, simple. For the first time, I feel like I'm doing something that really matters." Richard nodded, his gaze distant. "I spent so many years building the company, trying to leave behind a legacy, that I forgot to stop and appreciate what I already had. I should have been a better father to you and Lucas." "You did what you thought was best," Ethan said, his tone gentle. "And maybe we weren't ready to meet you halfway back then, but we can try now." Richard's eyes met his son's, a flicker of hope in his expression. "I'd like that." As the evening wore on, Claire and Walter struck up an easy conversation, their laughter drifting through the open windows of the farmhouse. Ethan watched them from the porch, feeling a strange but welcome sense of peace. For the first time, it felt like his two worlds were beginning to merge. Later that night, as Richard and Claire prepared to leave, Richard turned to Ethan. "I've been thinking about what you said, about doing something that matters. I'd like to help." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Help with what?" "With this," Richard said, gesturing to the farm. "Greenwood, the community, you've built something special here, and I'd like to support it. Maybe Bennett Construction can take a page out of your book and focus on sustainability." Ethan was taken aback, but nodded slowly. "That could work, but only if it's done the right way." Richard smiled. "I wouldn't have it any other way." The next morning, as the Bennetts drove away, Walter joined Ethan on the porch. "They're not what I expected," Walter said, his tone teasing. "A little stiff maybe, but not bad." Ethan chuckled. "They're trying. That's more than I ever thought they'd do." Walter patted his shoulder. "Well, it looks like you've got yourself a foot in two worlds now. Just make sure you don't lose sight of what's important." Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I won't." Ethan stood at the edge of Walter's fields, the early morning sun casting long shadows over the land he had grown to love. The soil beneath his boots felt familiar, grounding, a reminder of the simple life he had built in Greenwood. But the visit from his family had stirred something deeper, a realization that perhaps his past and present didn't have to remain separate. Walter joined him, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "Looks like you've got a lot on your mind this morning," the older man said, handing him a cup. Ethan nodded, sipping the bitter brew. "It's strange, for so long I thought I had to choose. The farm or my family, Greenwood or New York. But maybe there's a way to bring them together." Walter raised an eyebrow. "You're thinking about working with your father." "Not just him," Ethan said thoughtfully. "The company, the community. Bennett Construction's been about building skyscrapers and profit. But what if it could be more? What if it could build something that actually helps people?" Walter chuckled. "You sound like a farmer talking about city folks' money." Ethan smirked. "Maybe I am." Over the next few weeks, Ethan began to bridge the gap between Greenwood and Bennett Construction. With Richard's support, he initiated a pilot program to promote sustainable development practices. The first step was converting Walter's farm into a model for eco-friendly agriculture, a blueprint that could be replicated across other rural areas. Walter was skeptical at first. "Don't think I'm letting some fancy suits run my land," he grumbled, as Ethan explained the plans. "You'll still be in charge," Ethan reassured him. "This is about showing other farms how they can thrive without losing what makes them special." Walter reluctantly agreed, though he kept a watchful eye on the process. "You'll hear about it if they mess up," he warned. "I wouldn't expect anything less," Ethan replied with a grin. Back in New York, the changes at Bennett Construction were beginning to take shape, with Andrew out of the picture. The company's board approved Ethan's proposal to allocate resources toward community-based projects. Claire played a key role, using her diplomatic skills to navigate internal politics, while Lucas, determined to redeem himself, volunteered to oversee one of the initiatives. One afternoon, as the siblings met in Richard's office, Claire glanced at Ethan with a smile. "You're turning us into a bunch of idealists." "You know," Ethan shrugged, "maybe it's time we became something more than just another construction company." Lucas leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I'll admit, I didn't see it at first, but it feels right, like we're actually doing something that matters." Richard, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "It's what Ethan's always been good at, bringing people together. I see that now." The rare praise caught Ethan off guard, but he simply nodded. "We've got a long way to go, but it's a start." As the pilot program gained traction, Ethan split his time between Greenwood and New York. The transition wasn't always smooth. Balancing the fast pace of the city with the slower rhythms of the farm was a challenge, but he found purpose in the work. Walter's farm became a hub of activity, attracting visitors from across the state. Farmers came to learn about sustainable practices, while city planners studied how to integrate green spaces into urban development. Walter, though initially hesitant, took pride in showing off his land to curious onlookers. "Never thought I'd see the day when folks from the city cared about farming," he admitted one afternoon, watching a group of visitors tour the fields. Ethan smiled. "You'd be surprised what people care about when you show them why it matters." One evening, as Ethan sat on the porch of the farmhouse, Richard arrived unexpectedly. He stepped out of his car, looking slightly out of place in his tailored suit against the rustic backdrop. Didn't think I'd see you here again so soon," Ethan said, standing to greet him. Richard smiled faintly. "I wanted to see how things were going, and I wanted to spend some time with you." Ethan gestured for him to sit, and the two men settled into the creaky chairs, the quiet hum of crickets filling the air. "I was wrong," Richard said after a moment. "About a lot of things. I pushed too hard, expected too much, and I didn't stop to think about what any of you really needed." Ethan glanced at him, surprised by the admission. "You were trying to do what you thought was best. I get that now," Richard sighed. "Still, I wish I could have done it differently." "We can't change the past," Ethan said, "but we can try to do better now." Richard nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. "You've done more than I ever could have imagined. Ethan, I'm proud of you." The words, simple but heartfelt, struck a chord in Ethan. For so long, he had carried the weight of living up to his father's expectations. Hearing those words now felt like a release. "Thanks, Dad," he said quietly. Months later, Bennett Construction held a grand opening for its first community-driven project, a revitalized urban farm in New York City, inspired by the work at Walter's farm. The event drew a crowd of city officials, journalists, and local residents, all eager to see the company's new direction. Ethan stood alongside Richard, Claire, and Lucas as they cut the ceremonial ribbon. The applause was deafening, but what mattered most to Ethan was seeing the excitement in the eyes of the community members who would benefit from the project. As the crowd dispersed, Richard placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "This is just the beginning," he said. Ethan nodded. "It's a good beginning." That night, back in Greenwood, Ethan stood under the stars, looking out over the fields. Walter joined him, holding 2 glasses of whiskey. "You've done good, kid," Walter said, handing him a glass. Ethan raised it in a toast. "To you, Walter, for giving me a second chance." Walter chuckled. "To second chances, then." As they drank, Ethan felt a deep sense of contentment. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew he was on the right path. The journey had been long and painful, but it had led him to this moment, a moment of connection, purpose, and peace. And for the first time in years, he felt truly whole,